Well, welcome back to the Jacob Hornberger Show. Nice to be back with you guys. Laid off there for a couple of weeks, and nice to be back. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is my weekly show on the internet. I guess you probably have noticed the big controversy over the Senate's plan to codify the present situation with respect to the power of the Pentagon and the CIA, the U.S. government in general, to arrest Americans on U.S. soil, transfer them to military custody, throw them into a dungeon, torture them, execute them after some kind of kangaroo tribunal. Um, this is what we have been talking about for 10 years at the Future of Freedom Foundation. Time and time again, we've been telling people this is a major transformation in American life. In fact, I argue that this transformation, this enemy combatant doctrine, this doctrine that permits the government to seize people arbitrarily, cart them away to a military dungeon, incarcerate them forever, no trial, torture them, execute them, that this thing was going to go on forever. It's the largest transformation possibly in American history. I mean, I think it's even bigger than the Roosevelt New Deal administration, when our country's economic system got exchanged from free market, free enterprise over to socialism with the welfare state, the fascist society, the National Industrial Recovery Act, and so forth. I think this transformation of the legal system, empowering the government to do these things, is much bigger than that transformation, and that was a huge one. And of course, when the New Deal transformed America, one of the essential conditions that the statists felt were important was to convince people that it was all freedom. That Franklin Roosevelt's fascist and socialist programs were really just free enterprise devices. I mean, they didn't call them socialism and fascism, obviously. They wouldn't have gotten very far. They called them free enterprise devices to save free enterprise, reforms. The system needs reform. And they had argued, of course, that free enterprise had failed, and that's what caused the stock market crash. Never mind that it was the Federal Reserve that did the whole thing. They had to make the American people believe that it was free enterprise that failed, and that this newfangled system was just a reform to save free enterprise. And so we end up with this monstrosity on the domestic level, the welfare state, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the drug war, where the government's guiding us and monitoring us and watching over us like we're a bunch of little children, sending us to our room in a penitentiary somewhere if we put something bad into our mouths. Well, this thing works the same way. This enemy combatant doctrine, the war on terrorism, indefinite detention, and so forth. They had to convince Americans that this is freedom. Okay, it's just a freedom device to keep you safe, and that's what they said from the very beginning. And we were telling people over and over and over again that this was a giant transformation, an ominous transformation of American life. I mean, it was civil liberties under attack to the maximum degree. Because, after all, what is the most gigantic power that any totalitarian dictatorship can have in its possession? I mean, it's not just the power to tax people or control their economic activity, confiscate their guns. It's the most direct power is the power to just go out and send your military forces, your intelligence forces, and start rounding people up and using force to do it. You get a company of infantrymen, and you go in around, surround somebody's house, you barge down the door, and everybody's got his guns pulled. They're all SWAT team deals, and you go in there and you seize that person and you cart him away to a concentration camp or to a detention facility. You don't give him a trial. He's an enemy combatant. This is war, I mean, that's the most direct power. Oh, and guess what? That power goes back centuries into British history, into British tyranny. I mean, this was the most tyrannical power that the British people were so concerned with throughout all the centuries. In fact, that's what Magna Carta was all about. you know, when the barons of England held their own king, King John, at the point of a sword. I mean, they were rebelling against their king because their king had been going out just grabbing people, or through his military, grabbing people, carting them away to the Tower of London or some dungeon, putting them on the rack, torturing them, executing them for criticizing the government, for questioning the regime. And so, you know, along comes this rebellion at Runnymede, and they extract from the king. They win. They beat the king. They beat their own king, and they extract from him an admission that never again will he go and grab a person in violation of what Magna Carta called the law of the land. And that phrase, law of the land, gradually through the centuries of more and more resistance to the tyranny of their own government, the British government, that phrase came to be known as due process of law. So the idea was that, hey, Mr. King, or hey, Mr. President, or whatever, you're not going to be able to seize anybody and punish them for some criminal offense or alleged criminal offense unless you go through these procedures: due process of law, trial by jury, right to counsel, right to confront witnesses. I mean, these are the constitutional guarantees in the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. And the reason they were there, remember the reason why the Bill of Rights was enacted in the first place, was because the American people weren't enthusiastic about the idea of a federal government. You know, when it was proposed after the Constitutional Conventions, Americans were leery. They suspected that this new federal government would end up attracting totalitarian-like people, people that would do the same thing that the British king had been doing. And that's what they were concerned with. And, of course, there were those that said, oh, no, not in America. We don't have those kind of people in America. But the American people said, oh, bull. Those people exist everywhere. It's like in their DNA, and they're going to be coming after us, and they're going to be born and all this, and it doesn't matter how you bring them up or whatever. It's in their DNA to try to do these kind of things. And so how did they protect us or them? You know, they said, well, you know, we're going to demand this Bill of Rights, which was really a bill of prohibitions, and it didn't just guarantee freedom of speech and freedom of the press and gun rights and so forth. The 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments, 4 amendments dealing with the power of the government to go out and seize somebody and just cart them away. So those are the protections. It says, no, before you do that, you have to go through these obstacles. They're sort of like barbed wire entanglements that the government's required to go through. Well, that's the system we lived in, you know, for more than 200 years. I mean, it was really, I mean, there's a lot of problems with the criminal justice system in the federal system, but really when you compare it to all the others around the world and all the others in history, I mean, we had the greatest, you know, constitutional legal system that one can never imagine. I mean, these obstacles, these barbed wire entanglements were something that we were proud of. That, hey, if a foreigner came in, he would be treated just like an American. You know, he'd have to be indicted in a federal court. They'd have to prosecute him. He's entitled to presumption of innocence. If he couldn't afford a lawyer would be appointed for him. His justice in that system would be just like that of the American people. I mean, it was a remarkable system until 9/11 came along. And those of you that are familiar with Robert Higgs's book, Crisis in Leviathan, know that crises are the best way for government to get power, to expand their powers. Why? Well, it's obvious, because people are scared. And when people are scared, they're going to say, do whatever is necessary to make me safe, to keep me safe. All I want to do is just be kept safe. That's all I care about. So do whatever you think is necessary to keep me safe. Because people are scared, you know, their knees are knocking and stuff, and so that's the most dangerous time when it comes to liberty. And the framers understood this. Our ancestors understood this. That's why the Constitution had all these guarantees and protections, and no exception for crises. You know, that didn't say, hey, no law shall be passed respecting the regulation of speech, except during crises, because they wanted to make sure that even in crises, especially in crises, the government couldn't run roughshod over the rights and liberties of the people. And of course, that's what the New Deal was all about. I mean, people were afraid. Oh my gosh, we're going to starve to death. Oh my gosh, we're not going to be able to get a job. And how are we going to eat and so forth? And so, of course, Roosevelt saw this, licked his chops, and said, ha, 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 now I got my opportunity here. Social Security, National Industrial Recovery Act, Blue Eagle. I mean, it was fascism and socialism out the gazoo. And he used that crisis to do it. He knew people were afraid. That's what happened at 9/11. So 9/11, President Bush and all the statists in the government, statists outside the government, seized the opportunity. They saw the opportunity. People are afraid. My gosh, the terrorists are going to come and get us. And they magnify it. And they had color codes. And they would just say terrorism. And everybody would jump. And then they'd say WMDs. And everybody would quake. And so that's when President Bush says, I hereby decree that I have extraordinary powers. I'm a commander-in-chief now. I'm at war. I've got my helmet on, and I've got my military good to go. I got my CIA, and I've got all my DEA and everybody, and I'm a commander-in-chief. And I hereby decree that I've got the power to go out and seize anybody I want. And I'm going to call it, as long as I suspect them of terrorism, and I'm going to do whatever I want to them, because we're at war, but they're not real warriors. Those are illegal warriors. So I can do whatever I want to them. And that's what Guantanamo Bay was all about. I mean, I remember when they were forming Guantanamo Bay, this was going to be a Constitution-free zone. I mean, this was going to be a military operation, a military system that was going to be totally independent of any judicial system, any federal court, any Supreme Court. It was going to be a Pentagon-run operation. It's phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. Now, people were saying, "Oh, but Jacob, terrorism is an act of war. It's an act of war." And oh, really? Well, then why is it listed in the U.S. Code? I mean, you see, the U.S. Code is the list of all the crimes, the federal crimes. And you got terrorism in there. And the statists would just, they'd scratch their heads and say, well, it can't be in there. It just can't be in there. Terrorism's not a crime, Jacob. It's an act of war. Well, then the Justice Department starts indicting people for terrorism, like Zacharias Moussaoui and any other number of the Detroit bomber. And, I mean, countless terrorism cases all across the country. And this befuddled the statists again. They said, wait a minute, Jacob, that can't be. That can't be. And I said, well, you better get word to the federal judge, and you better get word to the federal prosecutors and those grand juries, because they're indicting people for terrorism, and they're trying people for terrorism. They're prosecuting them. They're convicting them. They're sending them to the federal penitentiary. You need to get word to those federal judges that they don't know what they're doing. Well, you see, it was ridiculous. Terrorism has always been a crime. It still is a crime. Okay? I mean, go look at the U.S. Code. Look at the dockets in federal courts all across the country. What Bush was saying was something truly extraordinary. He said, because I'm a commander-in-chief and because I've got a helmet on now, a military helmet, that I have the option of treating this crime as an act of war if I want to treat it that way. And if I decide to treat it that way, especially on foreigners, okay, 'cause, nobody likes foreigners, they're dangerous, then I can send those foreigners into a different system, a Constitution-free system, a Pentagon system where you got torture, you got presumption of guilt, you got kangaroo tribunals, you got executions, you don't have all these technicalities, you see, that they used to call that on the drug war. I mean, they hated the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. They've been scoffing them and laughing at them and making fun of them. They had prepared the population very well through the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s to just laugh at the Bill of Rights and say, those are just technicalities designed to let guilty people go free. So the stage had been set for that, especially in the drug war. And so 9/11 comes along, and Bush says, this is now within my arsenal, my tool chest, that if I get a suspected terrorist, I might send him into federal court, okay, pursuant to the Constitution, but I might not. I might send him to Guantanamo Bay for treatment that exists independent of the federal court system. Not even habeas corpus, the ancient writ that requires the government to bring a person in custody and show cause why he's being held. They even were canceling habeas corpus. It's just truly remarkable. And of course, the Supreme Court ultimately ruled, you're not going to do that in this country. This isn't the Soviet Union. This isn't Red China. This isn't North Korea. You're subject to the Constitution, boys and girls. You're going to be subject to the rulings of the Supreme Court. And, oh, by the way, yes, habeas corpus is part of our system. It's not part of the Soviet system, granted, but this ain't the Soviet system. This is the American system. Well, okay, so that goes on, but people say, well, Jacob, the statists were saying, oh, it's only on foreigners, Jacob. It's only on foreigners. So what? I mean, if it's wrong, it's wrong. And we kept saying that, the only right thing to do is follow the law, follow the Constitution. And this notion that they can convert a crime into an act of war was ludicrous. I mean, they could do it with the drug war. Oh, let's declare war on drugs. Oh, by the way, they already have. Well, then let's just make it a enemy combatant theory, that if we catch somebody smoking dope, well, we'll just send them down to Guantanamo Bay. And you very well may be reaching that point, because as everyone knows, they're now integrating the war on terrorism and the war on drugs. They got the troops in Latin America and the CIA in Latin America, and they're praising the military in Mexico for the 45,000 dead people that came about as a result of the war. Well, they're not praising the fact that the people are dead, but they're praising the war, which has produced those deaths. And so we very well may see these extraordinary powers being issued on the drug war, too. It would be just as ludicrous. But, people said, oh, Jacob, it's foreigners, it's foreigners. Well, hello, our criminal justice system has always treated foreigners just like Americans. You believe a foreigner's committed a crime, then by golly, you indict him and you go through all the same rigors that you do with respect to Americans. As I said earlier, this is what Americans once took great pride in as far as our legal system goes. But so we said it's wrong to be having this two-track type of system, one that has pursuant to law and the other one pursuant to, this military dictatorial type arbitrary totalitarian-like system with kangaroo tribunals and politics and preordained verdicts. And I mean, this is the stuff they do in the Soviet Union and China and stuff. And but we kept arguing at the Future of Freedom Foundation, they're going to extend this to Americans. That you sit there and you're cutting out all the protections for foreigners. You're cutting out the protections for us. You're letting them circumvent the Constitution after 200 years here. We'll be the first generations, we argued, that truly abandoned this most important aspect of a free society for the aura of safety, of security, of national security, and so forth. Well, we were proven right. That was what the Jose Padilla case was all about. They seized Padilla. They started to send him into the criminal justice system, but then they said, oh, no, he's a dangerous combatant. He's a dangerous combatant. We have the right to send him into the military system. So this guy's an American. They throw him into a military dungeon for some 3.5 years. They torture the heck out of him. They subject him to sensory deprivation. We were arguing the whole time how wrong this is to be treating Americans. But, the government's position is this is a no-good terrorist, dirty bombs, blah, blah, blah. Of course, a lot of the allegations never held any water, but that wasn't what mattered to them. What mattered to them was to win the case. And so they got a very unsympathetic defendant in there, and that is one that Americans would not be likely to sympathize with, so that Americans would cheer the government's winning of this case. And we kept arguing, if the government wins this case, it applies to all Americans, that you've lost for yourselves. So the government, has him in this dungeon. The government's telling the Court of Appeals, the Federal Court of Appeals, this man doesn't belong in federal court. He's an enemy combatant. We have a right to do this. We have the authority to do this. And the Federal Court of Appeals rules in favor of the government, which was a major transformation right there. That became the law. Okay? Now, the Supreme Court still had to decide, but guess what the government did at that point? They transferred this guy back to the federal courts as a criminal defendant. After telling the federal judges that he didn't belong in federal court, the government turns around and says, Oh, well, we've decided to do this after all. I mean, it showed what a charade the whole thing was. Why'd they do that? Because they didn't want to take the chance that the Supreme Court might reverse the case. Here they had a favorable ruling that now, that's the law now, that entitles them to round up people, send them into military dungeons, send them into concentration camps, simply on the basis of a label put on them by the military, the CIA, the president, that they're a terrorist. Okay? No court trial, no jury trial, no nothing. Now, we kept saying that since this was by decree by the president, it's much more dangerous than I mean, look how Mubarak, the dictator, Hosni Mubarak, the dictator of Egypt. Well, he has the same power. Okay, he got it. Surprise, surprise! At the height of a crisis, there was an assassination, of Anwar Sadat 30 years ago, and said, "Okay, the terrorists are coming to get us." It was their 9/11. And Mubarak said the same thing that Bush would say, 20 years later. The terrorists are coming to get us. The terrorists are coming to get us. I need emergency powers. And this was the major emergency power. The power to label somebody a terrorist, cart them away, no trial, no nothing. But at least he went to the Egyptian parliament. He says, "Would you give me these extraordinary powers?" Even Hitler. Hitler waged his war on terrorism after the firebombing of the Reichstag. That was done by a terrorist. Hitler declares war on terrorism. And Hitler also had the communist threat, the same Cold War that the U.S. would use to establish the national security state, the spying, the CIA, the assassinations, and so forth. Hitler was dealing with the Soviet Union too. So Hitler goes to the Reichstag and says, "Would you please give me temporary emergency powers?" And they said, "Well, how do we know it's going to be temporary? I'll come back every 6 months, and we'll ask for a renewal." Well, okay, so at least he does that. Now, of course, he uses the power to further entrench his dictatorship, just like Mubarak did. But here, Bush did not even bother to do that. He just he ruled by decree. He says, "I'm a commander-in-chief. I've got my helmet on. I get to do this." Obama has adopted that same position. "I'm a commander-in-chief too. This war is perpetual. I can do this." So when the Senate is now talking about codifying this, that's all they're doing. They're just codifying the situation. In other words, at least in Egypt, the parliament can repeal the grant of the emergency powers. Here, how does the Congress repeal something it never passed? And notice that 10 years after the emergency, they're now talking about making it a codified, well-entrenched, permanent part of American life. Mubarak's powers, they lasted 30 years. They're still lasting. This is what the demonstrators in Egypt are trying to do. They're trying to get these emergency powers lifted because that's what they're doing. They're using these powers to cart critics and dissidents and whatever into their torture chambers. And we all know how good their torture chambers are because the U.S. used the Egyptian torture chambers that the U.S. had paid for with its foreign aid and so forth. When the CIA kidnapped that guy in Italy, they whisked him away to Egypt to be tortured because of Egypt's renowned. It's renowned for being good torturers and having good torture facilities and so forth. So how do we achieve a free society? The Egyptians are demanding that Parliament, remove these from the military dictatorship. Over here, Obama's taking the position that he doesn't need any congressional codification. He's taking the position, you're interfering with me I'm a commander-in-chief. I'm at war. And so he's trying to get these inherent dictatorial powers the same way Bush did. I mean, to me, the only thing that can be done now is for Congress to order the president, to expressly prohibit the president from exercising these powers or possessing these powers. Now, whether the president would ignore it or not, may well ignore it. I mean, he ignores the constitutional provision on the declaration of war. But isn't it interesting that in Egypt, everyone understands that this power is part of a dictatorship, that this is the essence of dictatorship. And we look at Nazi Germany and we say, yes, that's the essence of dictatorship, when the Gestapo can just go barge into a person's home at night and cart him away to a concentration camp. That's the system we now live under that's being called freedom. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's thousands of people being rounded up and sent into the concentration camps or that people are being sent into military dungeons. What I'm suggesting is that the power is now possessed by the government. It's now in its tool chest. Major crisis hits, they start rounding up people. They got that Court of Appeals decision. That's what's so ominous. That's what's so dangerous about this thing. It is not what a free society is all about. It is antithetical to the principles of a free society. You cannot be free. Ask any Egyptian. You cannot be free as long as the government wields this kind of dictatorial power. So this codification is the worst thing because they're trying to take an emergency that happened 10 years ago and use that as the excuse to make this a permanent, entrenched part of American life. And we told people back 10 years ago, this war on terrorism is going to be perpetual. It's going to be like the war on drugs, which of course has gone on, for 40 years now? I mean, it's time that we question this whole paradigm. Everything. I mean, this is what libertarianism is all about, right? Dismantling this whole military-industrial complex, the Pentagon, all the contractors, the foreign bases, the foreign occupations, dismantle it all. And just like we ought to dismantle the welfare state. And I want to save the last few minutes to talk about another aspect of dictatorial conduct. And did you see where the Federal Reserve loaned, I don't even know how much money, unbelievable amounts of money to the EU countries? I mean, over there, they've got their little welfare state, their big welfare state. They've had spending out the gazoo and borrowing out the gazoo, and they don't want to cut people's dole because the dole recipients are getting mad. The Germans don't want to bail them out, and so all of a sudden, the Federal Reserve comes into this thing and goes on the hook. I mean, here we've got this debt-ridden, bankrupt regime in this country. The Federal Reserve is out there lending unbelievable amounts of money. Now they say, the risk is not too much. Well, what does that mean, not too much? If the Eurozone collapses, there's no telling what's going to happen with respect to all these loans that have just been made by the Federal Reserve. Now, granted, it may all turn out all right, but what business does the Federal Reserve have underwriting, subsidizing the welfare state woes of the European countries? Did you see Congress debate this issue? Did you see them, calling for a vote on whether American taxpayers should subsidize or guarantee the loans, the welfare state of the Europeans? No. I mean, isn't that what Congress is supposed to be all about? And here you have this little monetary dictatorship that says, we don't give a hoot what the American people do. We'll just put them on the hook. And if things go sour, we just print the money. Whatever amount of money needs to be printed, we'll do it. Here's another aspect of a part of our life that's antithetical to a free society. There's no way you can reconcile that kind of conduct. This is a board that's not elected. It's just a bunch of bureaucrats, central planners that are out there putting the American people further on the hook. I mean, you know what the hook you're on in terms of your share of the national debt, right? I mean, you owe about $45,000 per family member. And, this debt ceiling just got lifted, so they're borrowing more money. They're piling debt on top of debt, and all of a sudden, here's the Fed going on the hook. And that's not all. The International Monetary Fund is now committing to bail out the welfare state of Greece and Italy and so forth. Guess who funds the International Monetary Fund? You do, with your tax monies, because you see the federal government doesn't want to make it look like they're taxing you to give money to them, so they use the conduit of the International Monetary Fund to use the IRS to take your money, give it to the IMF, and the IMF funds the dole recipients in their welfare states over there. So obviously, the solution again is libertarianism. Dismantle the Fed. End the Fed. You've heard that one, right? Abolish the Fed and have a free market monetary system, or secondarily a gold standard where gold is money, silver coins are money, instead of this irredeemable paper money, and get rid of the central bank and let the free market reign. That's our heritage. That's what this country was born in, well, sure, with the big exception of slavery and lots of minor exceptions, but the idea of a free market, of a gold standard where gold is money and silver coins are money and a limited government republic instead of a massive military empire that is over there adopting policies that are inherent parts of dictatorial regimes. That's our job. That's our job as libertarians, to continue spreading these ideas. And they're gaining sway. They're scared to death. They see libertarianism rising in popularity in the political arena, where they've tried to ignore libertarians, and all of a sudden they're having to attack libertarians. But they see the young people are energized by libertarian ideas. I mean, these are exciting times. They're dangerous times. They're ominous times. They're stormy times. But remember that sometimes when you're reaching that mountaintop, that's when things do get stormier. I mean, that may be a sign we may be getting closer. And that's the solution. I mean, libertarianism is the only solution to the welfare state, warfare state woes that afflict our nation. That's the show. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.